Hi everyone, welcome to my final presentation for my Communication for Environmental Professionals class. Today I'll be talking about reevaluating perspective on climate change with economically viable solutions. My name is Caitlin Mochi, and let's get started. So, an issue of climate change solutions is the economic aspect of how to implement those changes. Communicating climate change solutions that are both economically viable and have measurable changes has always been criticized. While environmentalists call for drastic measures and massive overhaul of energy systems to stop climate change, those who acknowledge the need for change don't necessarily agree with extreme changes at their economic expense. There has to be some type of balance between pragmatic environmental solutions and the changes that they'll create. Not only does there need to be strong communication about the effectiveness of fixing climate change, but there also has to be a dialogue about the benefits to society economically as a result of implementing these changes. Climate change has been the most devastating consequence of atmospheric pollution due to society's capitalistic model. This current model is problematic because it means that a finite natural resource is converted to wealth or cash for the supplier. It is not designed to provide people with what they want or need. According to this exchange of capital for wealth, the benefits are not for society as a whole, but for a select few individuals. Therefore, there's a massive waste of natural resources and a creation of excessive, unnecessary waste. This exchange is not equal among all economic class groups. About 80% of the world's resources used yearly are consumed by 20% of the global population. Mechanics of capitalism depend on supply and demand dynamics. When there is no supply, these mechanics reward the creation of a supply where there previously might not have been one. People buy things they don't necessarily want or need quite often due to intense advertising campaigns. Advertising for products is created by companies and specifically designed to convince the public to buy their products. These markets would not necessarily exist otherwise. It creates a plethora of materials that are wasted and pollution from the creation and transportation of them. To solve this problem, restrictions and defined limitations must be placed to slow the consumption of natural resources. However, despite the necessity for such restrictions and limitations, people don't take well to drastic changes in their lives, especially when it concerns them personally and financially, making climate change solutions that much harder. Humans have been accustomed to this model in society for as long as buying and selling has existed. Fossil fuels have made this process much faster and easier. Confronting climate change requires limiting or stopping the use of cheap energy fossil fuels that humanity has been dependent on for about 300 years. So, where's the balance between achieving public need for economic development and the global need to solve climate change? Equity and efforts to preserve development need to be filtered through an environmental science frame. Environmental scientists need to understand that the public resistance to change in their personal lives and financial interests in order to gain their trust and support for climate change initiatives. Those protecting their financial interests have, without a doubt, undermined efforts to address climate change. By taking this view into perspective, climate scientists could communicate the issue that affect the public while keeping the public from dismissing the science involved. Now, most people agree on viable solutions such as funding renewable energy sources and limiting carbon dioxide emissions, even if they don't understand the science. And by agreeing to those solutions, they feel like they're part of a bigger movement, and they're willing to acknowledge that the issue is real. Research has showed that when a social dimension is added, like when someone feels they're part of a collective movement, campaigns for individual and household level climate change action is successful. So even though this response is positive, there's still more to be done to communicate with the public effectively on what the solutions are. Economists advocate for milder policies that let the environment take a hit in the long run, while environmental scientists argue for more radical transformations. Many climate scientists push for a carbon tax, which would be efficient in limiting our atmospheric carbon input, but it has major political liability. Australia is an example of how implementing rapid change has a huge effect on public response to climate change policies. In 2012, They were the first country to implement the national carbon tax. However, in 2014, they also became the first country to repeal a national carbon tax. It was originally created to start a transition from fossil fuels to renewable clean energy. And even though it did reduce emissions by 1 to 2% in the power generation sector, investments initially promised never happened. So this attempt failed because the economic cost outweighed the perceived environmental benefits. And this just goes to show that it supports the argument that uncertainties of climate change initiatives are just too big to justify rapid action. So the hardest part will be designing solutions that take these theories and put them into practice. Uncertainty leads to the public favoring current conditions that they already are accustomed to and that they understand. A solution could be the way that climate scientists frame the issue of balancing environmental need and economic growth. Framing affects how the public assesses a different idea to be more important or impactful. Since most people learn about climate change issues from media, looking at how media frames climate change is important in order to figure out how the public wants to address climate change. This is important for climate change scientists in order to be able to figure out how to include the public's economic support. Most media sources use extremely negative consequences of climate change in order to frame their points. But without clear solutions to solve climate change that the public couldn't implement, these efforts often lead to inaction. In conclusion, there needs to be stronger communication between the public, scientists, and energy stakeholders about balancing economic development with viable climate change solutions. The capitalistic model creates excessive waste and uses up an unnecessary number of natural resources. Since society has been using this model of economic growth for so long, changing this way of life will be difficult. Confronting climate change issues caused by this will need open dialogue that takes the public's financial interest into account when implementing solutions. With proper framework and open communication between climate scientists and the public, the creation of viable solutions that compromise environmental improvement and economic development will lead to more individuals reevaluating how they perceive climate change at the environmental level. These are my sources, and if you have any other questions, be happy to take those questions. Thank you.